Hello, my friends, and welcome to Letters from Paradise, episode number 64, which I've called Audience. Why this title? Well, it's because we're talking about the Bible, and key to learning more from the scripture is to discover the audience to whom a Bible passage is directed. Here's some questions I ask the scripture as I read it. To whom are you speaking? For whom were you written? What was happening or about to happen to the first audience, the first hearers of this passage? Jesus draws our attention to the importance of applying this first audience principle. After describing and prophesying a whole sequence of startling events, I'm referring to what we read in Matthew 24 or Luke 21, what's known as the Olivet Discourse. He turns to his audience and says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place." So the wars, famines, persecutions, the Lord coming, the signs in the heavens, all that astonishing drama, if Jesus is to be believed, was fulfilled whilst the people who were listening to him on that day were still alive. For them it was prophecy, but for us it's history. Jesus would have been telling them these things around 30 AD, and just 40 years later, in 70 AD, all these things, as he had told them, exploded upon the very city in which they were standing. Unless we had brought our first audience questions to the text, we could now be living with all kinds of fear for the future. Conspiracy theories would abound. But we'd be looking at the world and looking at the scripture through a completely wrong lens. And this is interesting. The only writer who did not include the Olivet Discourse in his gospel was John. However, around the same time John is writing his gospel in the late 60s AD, he receives a vision from Jesus of what must shortly take place. And what we know as the book of Revelation unfolds. That's right, John's version of the Olivet Discourse coming just a few short years before its fulfillment to remind that generation of how Jesus had reassured them 40 years earlier. AD 67 is a momentous year. The persecution of the young church by the temple priests and Pharisees is at full pace. The pressure on the Jewish believers to return to the temple with its sacrifices and requirements is unrelenting, and some are going back. John is in exile on the Isle of Patmos, where he is sentenced to labour in the island's mines. It's there he receives his revelation, the last book of the Bible to be written. The believers are being betrayed and martyred in the most shocking ways by the beastly Nero, the maniac emperor of Rome. On the 29th of June, Paul is beheaded and Peter is crucified in Rome. In the spring of AD 67, Nero will send Vespasian and 60,000 troops into Judea, everywhere spreading the most cruel devastation. However, the believers across the Roman Empire continue to gather where they can, and two documents are being circulated, hand-copied and spread among them. John's Gospel, which reminds these persecuted believers that Christ abides in them and they in him. The second document had some people in the room gasping in awe, for they had been in the first audience when Jesus pointed to the temple and said, "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." And now Jesus is saying through John, "These things must shortly come to pass. Behold, I am coming quickly." History records the total destruction of Jerusalem and its temple by the Roman forces. A bloody siege lasting 5 months in which over 1 million people lost their lives to famine, pestilence, or sword. Everything spoken by Christ was fulfilled. And every Christian believer to whom Jerusalem was home heeded the words of Jesus to flee and escaped through a series of miraculous opportunities. Dear friends, this catastrophic event helps us understand the New Testament. It's the elephant in the room. And often when Jesus or the epistle writers speak of being saved or of coming destruction, it's AD 70 to which they refer. This is often true of Jesus' parables. It's the wrath to come that John the Baptist spoke of. And the epistles are full of AD 70 warning and comfort. We owe so much to Jesus and John's first audience. They heeded what they heard and claimed for us a gospel without laws and requirements, statutes or sacrifices, a heritage for all who love the Lord for generations to come. Shalom.